The autumn wind carried secrets through the town of Taylor, Wyoming Territory, 1878 secrets and the faint scent of impending snow. Eleanor Harmon stood on the darkened porch of her newly inherited homestead, her heart as cold as the night air around her. Clutching the rusty lantern in her trembling hand, she stared into the vast emptiness of the frontier, wondering if she'd made the greatest mistake of her 22 years by coming west after her father's death. Eleanor's lantern flickered in the wind, threatening to extinguish her only source of light in the encompassing darkness. Panic rose in her chest as she cupped her hand around the faltering flame, but the gust proved too strong for her slender fingers. "Allow me, madam," came a deep voice from the shadows. Eleanor gasped, nearly dropping the lantern entirely. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, his face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger approached cautiously, respectfully keeping his distance while extending his hands. The cowboy cupped his hands around the flame, shielding it from the wind's assault. These Wyoming nights can be mighty unforgiving to a lone light. In the newly stabilized glow, Eleanor could finally see his face weathered by sun and wind, but kind-eyed and younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps no more than 25. His clothes marked him as a working man, a cowboy, as she'd correctly assessed. "Thank you, sir," Eleanor said, straightening her posture despite her exhaustion. "I'm afraid I'm still adjusting to life out here." "Name's Benjamin Jordan, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Most folks call me Ben. I work at the Rocking Horse Ranch just north of here." "Eleanor Harmon," she replied, her Boston accent prominent against his Western drawl. "I've just arrived to claim my father's property." Ben's expression changed subtly. "Harold Harmon was your father?" Eleanor nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "You knew him?" "Everybody in Taylor knew Harold," Ben replied, his voice softening. "Fine man, we were all mighty sorry to hear of his passing." Eleanor fought back tears. Her father had left Boston years ago, seeking his fortune in the West. His occasional letters had painted a picture of prosperity and adventure, but standing before his dilapidated cabin now, Eleanor wondered how much of that had been true. "I should be going," Ben said, stepping back. "Just saw your light from the road and thought you might need assistance." "Actually," Eleanor said before she could stop herself, "would you mind coming inside for a moment? The latch on the door seems stuck and she stopped, embarrassed by her helplessness. Ben nodded understandingly. "Lead the way, Miss Harmon." Inside, the cabin was cold and dusty, evidence of the months it had sat empty following Harold's death. Eleanor placed the lantern on a small table, casting long shadows across the single room that served as both kitchen and living area. A narrow ladder led to what she presumed was a sleeping loft. "Your father built this place himself," Ben said, examining the sturdy wooden beams. "Started with just this room and added on bit by bit." Eleanor glanced around, trying to imagine her refined father constructing this rustic dwelling. It doesn't seem large enough to be a profitable ranch. Ben shifted uncomfortably. "Well, madam, your father's ranch was considerably larger once. This cabin sits on what's left." "What's left?" Eleanor echoed, her stomach tightening. "I don't understand." Ben removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "There was a drought 2 years back. Hit everyone hard. Your father sold most of his land to keep from losing everything." He hesitated. "What's left is about 5 acres, including this cabin." Eleanor sank into a chair, the reality of her situation becoming clearer. "And I suppose the remainder isn't enough to sustain a living." "Not cattle ranching, no," Ben admitted, "but there's good soil for growing, and the creek that runs through the north end hasn't dried up in living memory." Eleanor stared at her hands, wondering what she would write to her aunt back in Boston. She'd left with such determination, such certainty that she would make her father's legacy flourish. Now she wasn't sure she could even feed herself through winter. "Miss Harmon," Ben said gently, "if you'll permit me, I could come by tomorrow, help you get this place in proper order." He gestured to the door. "Fix that latch for starters." Eleanor looked up at him, this stranger who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. In Boston, she would never have considered accepting help from a man she'd just met, But this wasn't Boston, and she wasn't the same privileged young woman who'd boarded the train west. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Jordan," she said finally. "Ben," he corrected with a small smile. "Out here, formality doesn't keep you warm or put food on your table." "Eleanor, then," she replied, returning his smile despite herself. "And yes, I would appreciate your help." "I'll be by after my morning duties," he said, replacing his hat. "Try to get some rest. Things have a way of looking better in the morning light." After Ben left, securing the troublesome door latch as best he could, Eleanor climbed the ladder to the loft. A narrow bed with a straw mattress awaited her, along with a small trunk that presumably contained her father's personal effects. Too exhausted to explore further, she lay down fully clothed, pulling a rough woolen blanket around her shoulders. As sleep began to claim her, Eleanor found herself thinking of Benjamin Jordan's kind eyes and the gentle way his hands had cupped the lantern flame. In this strange new world where she had no allies and no clear path forward, perhaps she had found at least one person she could trust. True to his word, Ben arrived the following morning as the sun climbed above the eastern hills. Eleanor, who had risen at dawn out of habit, had already attempted to tidy the cabin and take inventory of its meager contents. The pantry held some basic provisions: flour, beans, coffee, salt, but nothing that would sustain her for long. "Good morning," Ben called from outside, his voice carrying through the thin walls. Eleanor opened the door, surprised to find him accompanied by a loaded pack-horse. "What's all this? Thought you might need some supplies," he said, unloading a sack of potatoes. "And tools." "Can't fix much without proper tools." Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment. "Mr. Jordan, Ben, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't accept charity." Ben straightened, fixing her with a steady gaze. "It's not charity, Eleanor, it's being neighborly. Your father would have done the same for any newcomer." She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter with the supplies. Over the next few hours, Ben worked steadily, repairing the door latch, securing loose floorboards, and checking the stovepipe for blockages. Eleanor assisted where she could, learning more about her new home with each task. "Your father kept meticulous records," Ben said, examining a ledger he'd found on a shelf. "Might be worth looking through these to understand what you're working with." Eleanor took the book, her fingers tracing her father's familiar handwriting. "I still can't believe he's gone. His last letter was so full of plans for the future." Ben's expression softened. "Harold never lost hope, even when things were at their worst. He talked about you all the time, how proud he was of his educated daughter back east. Did he ever mention why he never asked me to join him?" Eleanor couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. "He wanted to build something worthy of you first," Ben replied simply. "Something that would make leaving your comfortable life worthwhile." Eleanor closed the ledger, her throat tight. "And instead, I've inherited 5 acres and a leaking roof, and some of the most beautiful land in the territory," Ben added. "Plus, this cabin is solid at its core. Your father built it to last." By midday, they had made significant improvements to the cabin's functionality. Ben had repaired the most pressing issues and helped Eleanor organize the space more efficiently. Outside, he'd shown her the small vegetable garden that had gone to seed but could be revived come spring. "I should get back to the ranch," he said eventually, "but I'll stop by again tomorrow if that's agreeable." Eleanor nodded, surprised by how much she'd come to rely on his presence in just one day. "I would appreciate that, and thank you for everything." As Ben mounted his horse, he hesitated. "There's a gathering at the town hall tomorrow evening, harvest celebration. Might be a good opportunity for you to meet some of the townsfolk." Eleanor considered this. She had planned to keep to herself until she determined her next steps, but isolation wouldn't serve her well in this environment. "Perhaps I will attend." Ben smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I'll come by around 6 then. We can ride in together." As she watched him ride away, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of emotions. Gratitude for his assistance, certainly, but also something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Shaking off the feeling, she returned to the cabin, determined to make it more habitable before nightfall. The ledgers proved illuminating. Her father had indeed sold most of his land to pay off debts, but he'd retained the best portions, the creek access and the fertile soil of the valley. His final entries spoke of plans for fruit trees and specialty crops that might fetch higher prices than standard wheat or corn. Eleanor ran her fingers over the last page, dated just 3 days before his death from pneumonia. "Eleanor will know what to do," he had written. "She has her mother's practicality and her old father's dreams." Tears blurred her vision. She had always considered herself a practical woman, but what did she know of farming or ranching? Her education had prepared her for Boston society, not frontier survival. As darkness fell, she lit the lantern more carefully this time and continued reading through her father's papers. Among them, she found letters she had sent him over the years, carefully preserved. He had kept every one. The next evening, Eleanor dressed in her finest remaining dress, a simple blue cotton that had traveled well. She had washed her hair in water heated on the stove and pinned it up in a modest style. Looking in the small mirror above the wash basin, she hardly recognized herself. Just days in the Wyoming air had already given her pale complexion a healthy glow. Ben arrived precisely at 6, dressed in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. He paused momentarily at the sight of her, an expression Eleanor couldn't quite interpret crossing his face. "You look lovely," he said finally, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Thank you," she replied, unused to such direct compliments. Boston men tended toward flowery, insincere flattery. Ben's straightforward admiration was refreshingly different. The ride to town took nearly 30 minutes, during which Ben pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area. Taylor had begun as a small trading post 15 years earlier and had grown into a modest but respectable town serving the surrounding ranches and farms. "Most folks are good people," Ben explained. "Hard-working, honest, but like anywhere we have our share of troublemakers." "Such as?" Eleanor asked, curious about the social dynamics of her new home. Ben's expression darkened slightly. "The Millbrook brothers own the largest ranch in the county now. They've been buying up land whenever someone falls on hard times. Your father refused to sell to them, even when they offered more than the land was worth." "Why would he refuse a better offer?" "Because the Millbrooks don't care about the land or the people who work it. They care about power." Ben glanced at her. "They've been trying to control water rights in the valley. Your father's creek access was valuable to them." Eleanor considered this information carefully. "And now that he's gone, they'll likely approach you with an offer," Ben said grimly. "Probably already know you're here." The town hall was illuminated with lanterns, warm light spilling from its windows. Inside, long tables were laden with food and a small band played lively tunes. People of all ages filled the space, talking, laughing, and dancing. Ben stayed close to Eleanor's side as he introduced her to various townspeople. Most expressed condolences for her father and welcomed her to Taylor, though she noted some curious glances and whispered comments behind raised hands. "Don't mind them," Ben murmured. "New faces are rare enough to cause a stir, especially when they're as pretty as yours." Eleanor felt herself blushing and was grateful for the dimly lit room. "Is that Sheriff Miller?" she asked, changing the subject and nodding toward a gray-haired man with a star pinned to his vest. "That's him," Ben confirmed. "Good man, though getting on in years. His deputy does most of the actual peacekeeping these days." As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of community celebration. The food was plentiful if plain, and the music, while not as refined as what she was accustomed to, had an honest energy that made her foot tap beneath her skirts. "Would you care to dance?" Ben asked after they had eaten, gesturing toward the cleared area where several couples were already moving to the music. Eleanor hesitated. "I'm afraid I don't know these dances." "Nothing to know," Ben assured her with a smile. "Just follow my lead." The dance was indeed simpler than the formal waltzes Eleanor had learned in finishing school, but it required more energy and provided far more enjoyment. Ben proved to be a capable dancer, guiding her through the steps with a firm but gentle hand at her waist. "You're a natural," he told her as they completed their second dance, both slightly out of breath. "You're a good teacher," she replied, surprised by how much fun she was having. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of two well-dressed men who approached with purpose. The older of the pair, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, fixed his gaze on Eleanor. "You must be Harold's daughter," he said, his tone falsely genial. "Victor Millbrook, this is my brother Clarence." Eleanor felt Ben tense beside her but maintained her composure. "Eleanor Harmon." "Yes, I've recently arrived to manage my father's property." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A difficult undertaking for a young woman alone. I'd be happy to discuss relieving you of that burden. We could speak privately." "Miss Harmon is here to enjoy the celebration," Ben interjected. "Business can wait for another day." Clarence Millbrook, taller and leaner than his brother but with the same cold eyes, looked Ben up and down dismissively. "I wasn't aware that ranch hands had authority to speak for landowners, Jordan." Eleanor straightened her spine, drawing on every lesson in proper behavior she'd ever received. "Mr. Jordan is correct. This isn't the time for business discussions. However, if you wish to call at my property next week, I would be willing to hear what you have to say." Victor's expression hardened momentarily before he forced another smile. "Very well, Tuesday morning would be convenient for us." "Tuesday afternoon would be convenient for me," Eleanor countered smoothly. "Around 2 o'clock. The brothers exchanged glances. "Tuesday at 2, then," Victor agreed. "Good evening, Miss Harmon." As they walked away, Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They're rather intimidating." "They mean to be," Ben said quietly. "Eleanor, be careful with them. They didn't get where they are by being fair or honest." She nodded, her enjoyment of the evening somewhat diminished. "I'll keep that in mind." The remainder of the celebration passed pleasantly enough, though Eleanor noticed the Millbrook brothers watching her from across the room. By the time she and Ben departed, the moon was high in the sky, casting silver light across the landscape. "Thank you for accompanying me," Eleanor said as they rode home. "I don't think I would have had the courage to attend alone." "You would have," Ben replied with certainty. "You're stronger than you realize." The comment warmed her more than it should have. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip of horse hooves and the occasional cry of a night bird. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor ventured finally. "Of course." "How did you come to know my father so well? You speak of him as more than just a neighbor." Ben was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "I came to Wyoming when I was 17, looking for work. Your father gave me a job when no one else would take a chance on a skinny kid with no experience." He paused. "When this land was still a working ranch, I was his foreman. After he had to sell most of it, he helped me get a position at the Rocking Horse." "You were his friend," Eleanor realized. "I'd like to think so," Ben said. "He was a good man who had some bad luck, but he never lost faith that things would turn around." When they reached Eleanor's cabin, Ben insisted on checking the perimeter before she entered, a precaution she found both unnecessary and touching. At the door, they stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "I have tomorrow off," Ben said finally. "If you're amenable, I thought I might help you assess the property properly, make plans for spring planting." "That would be very helpful," Eleanor said, ignoring the flutter in her stomach at the prospect of spending another day in his company. "But you've already done so much. I don't want to impose on your free time." Ben's smile was barely visible in the moonlight. "It's no imposition, Eleanor. I promised your father I'd look after his place until you arrived. I'd like to see it become what he always believed it could be." "Then I accept," she said, "and I'm grateful." After Ben left, Eleanor prepared for bed, her mind racing with everything she'd learned. The Millbrook brothers clearly wanted her land, but what exactly made it so valuable to them? And what was her best course of action? Sell and return to Boston with whatever funds she could secure, or stay and attempt to fulfill her father's vision? As she drifted towards sleep, Eleanor found herself thinking once again of Benjamin Jordan, his steady presence, his integrity, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. In just 2 days, he had become her anchor in this unfamiliar world. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day. Eleanor had risen early, eager to explore her property in daylight with someone who knew its potential. She had just finished a simple breakfast when she heard the now familiar sound of Ben's horse approaching. Together, they spent the morning walking the boundaries of the property, Ben pointing out features that might not be obvious to an untrained eye: the subtle changes in soil quality, the natural drainage patterns, the places where the land caught the best sun. "Your father always said this south-facing slope would be perfect for fruit trees," Ben explained, indicating a gentle rise. "Apple, pear, maybe some plums. The hills protect it from the worst of the north wind." Eleanor tried to envision the bare land transformed into an orchard. "How long would trees take to produce fruit?" 3, maybe 4 years for the first crop, Ben admitted. "But once established, they'd produce for decades. And in the meantime, vegetables in spring and summer, maybe keep a few chickens, a milk cow." He looked at her questioningly. "Do you know anything about farming, Eleanor?" She laughed softly. "Absolutely nothing. In Boston, food simply appeared on the table, prepared by our cook." Instead of the judgment she half expected, Ben nodded thoughtfully. "You can learn. Your father did." He arrived knowing more about banking than beans, but he studied and asked questions and worked harder than men half his age. They continued to the creek, a clear, swift-running stream that cut through the northern edge of the property. Ben explained how it could be used for irrigation through a system of ditches, and how it never ran dry, even in the worst drought years. "This is why the Millbrooks want your land," he said, crouching to dip his hand in the cold water. "They've been trying to control all the water access in the valley. If they succeed, they can effectively control every other ranch and farm by charging for water rights." Eleanor frowned. "That's why my father refused to sell to them." "Partly," Ben agreed. "And partly because he believed in the potential of this place. He wanted to leave you something worthwhile." As they made their way back toward the cabin, Eleanor's mind was busy with calculations and possibilities. "Even if I wanted to plant an orchard or establish proper fields, I would need capital. Seeds, tools, livestock, it all requires money I don't have." Ben was silent for a moment. "There's the town bank. Mr. Whitman is fair, though cautious with loans to unproven ventures." He hesitated. "There might be another way, though." "What's that?" "Partnership," he said simply. "There are folks around here with skills and supplies who might be willing to invest labor instead of money in exchange for a share of future profits." Eleanor looked at him closely. "Are you proposing such an arrangement, Mr. Jordan?" A slight flush colored his tanned face. "I might be. I have savings, not much, but enough for some basic supplies. More importantly, I know ranching and farming. I worked this land with your father for 5 years." "And what would you want in return?" Eleanor asked, her business sense asserting itself despite her growing personal regard for the man. "A third of any profits for the first 5 years," he said promptly. "And the opportunity to buy in as a proper partner after that if things go well." Eleanor considered the proposal. It was fair, perhaps even generous considering her complete lack of relevant skills. More importantly, it would allow her to stay and attempt to build something from her father's remaining land rather than selling out to the Millbrooks. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. "It's a significant decision," Ben nodded, showing no sign of disappointment at her non-committal response. "Of course, take all the time you need." They reached the cabin, and Ben helped her draw water from the well for lunch, a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee that they shared at the small table inside. The domesticity of the scene wasn't lost on Eleanor, who found herself imagining more such shared meals in the future. "Tell me about Boston," Ben said as they ate. "I've never been east of the Missouri River." Eleanor described her life there: the refined society, the cultural events, the comfort and security of established civilization. As she spoke, she realized how distant that life already seemed, like a story she'd read rather than experienced. "It sounds very orderly," Ben commented when she finished. Eleanor laughed. "It was. Everything had its proper place and time. Everyone knew exactly what was expected of them." She looked around the simple cabin. "This is the opposite in every way." "And yet you came," Ben observed. "You could have sold this place by letter, never set foot in Wyoming." "I wanted to see it," she admitted. "To understand what drew my father here and kept him, even when things became difficult." She met Ben's gaze across the table. "I think I'm beginning to understand." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Ben stood, breaking the spell. "I should check your roof before I go. Looks like rain might be moving in." While Ben worked on the roof, Eleanor returned to her father's ledgers, this time with a specific purpose. If she were to consider Ben's partnership proposal or approach the bank for a loan, she needed to understand the financial history of the property. What she discovered was both troubling and illuminating. Her father had indeed been in substantial debt when he sold most of his land, but the sale had cleared those debts entirely. The remaining property, while small, was unencumbered. More interestingly, her father had noted several potential business opportunities beyond traditional ranching, the orchard Ben had mentioned, but also beekeeping, specialized crops for the growing railroad towns, and even a proposal for a small creamery to process milk from neighboring farms. By the time Ben descended from the roof, Eleanor had made up her mind. "I'd like to accept your partnership proposal," she said without preamble, "but with one condition." Ben raised his eyebrows. "What condition?" "That we consider some of my father's alternative business ideas rather than focusing solely on traditional crops or livestock." A slow smile spread across Ben's face. "I think your father would approve of that condition, Miss Harmon." "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Jordan," Eleanor said, extending her hand. Ben's calloused palm met hers, warm and steady. "We do indeed." The handshake lasted perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, both of them aware of some shift in their relationship, no longer merely neighbors or friends, but partners with a shared future. The following day, Eleanor rode into town alone, determined to establish herself as more than just Harold's daughter. Her first stop was the general store, where she purchased essential supplies and introduced herself to Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor's wife, who proved to be a valuable source of information about the town and its inhabitants. "The Millbrooks have been putting pressure on small landowners for years," Mrs. Patterson confided as she wrapped Eleanor's purchases. "Started buying up properties after the drought, offering cash when folks were desperate. Now they control nearly half the valley." "What about the water rights issue?" Eleanor asked, recalling Ben's concerns. Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. "They've been damming streams on their property, diverting water. Some smaller farms have already gone dry. The sheriff says there's no law against it since the water originates on their land, but it's not right." Eleanor's next stop was the bank, where she introduced herself to Mr. Whitman, a thin, precise man with spectacles and a skeptical expression. She explained her intention to develop her father's remaining property along with her newly formed partnership with Benjamin Jordan. "Jordan's a hard worker," Whitman acknowledged, "but farming is a risky business, Miss Harmon, especially on a small scale. Have you considered the Millbrooks' offer? I understand they're prepared to pay a fair price." "I haven't heard their offer yet," Eleanor replied, "but I'm not inclined to sell regardless of the amount. The land has been in my family for over a decade, and I intend to honor my father's vision for it." Whitman studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Very well. If you decide you need financing for your venture, come see me with a detailed plan. I can't promise anything, but I'll give it fair consideration." By the time Eleanor returned to the cabin, the sky had darkened with approaching rain. She hurried to secure her horse and bring in the supplies, just managing to get everything inside before the first heavy drops began to fall. The rain continued through the night and into the next day, keeping Eleanor confined to the cabin. She used the time productively, organizing her father's papers and beginning to draft a business plan for the bank. Her education in Boston had included accounting and business principles, skills she had never expected to use in such a direct manner. By Tuesday morning, the rain had passed, leaving the world washed clean and vibrant. Eleanor spent the morning preparing for the Millbrooks' visit, both mentally and physically. She tidied the cabin, prepared coffee, and reviewed her notes on local land values based on her father's records. Ben arrived shortly before 1 o'clock, having ridden over from the rocking horse despite Eleanor's assurance that she could handle the meeting alone. "I don't doubt your ability," he said, dismounting, "but the Millbrooks respect strength in numbers, if nothing else. Besides, I know their tactics better than you do." Eleanor couldn't argue with his reasoning, and truth be told, she was grateful for his presence. Together they reviewed their strategy, listened to the offer, reveal nothing of their own plans, and make no commitments. The Millbrook brothers arrived precisely at 2, accompanied by a third man whom they introduced as their lawyer, Mr. Pearson. The cabin felt crowded with 5 adults, but Eleanor maintained her composure, serving coffee and listening politely as Victor Millbrook extolled the virtues of their offer. $2,500, he concluded, cash in hand. More than fair for 5 acres, especially considering the condition of the buildings. Eleanor kept her expression neutral despite her surprise at the generous amount. "That is indeed a substantial offer, Mr. Millbrook. We're prepared to be generous," Clarence added smoothly. "Out of respect for your father." Ben remained silent beside her, though she could sense his tension. "May I ask why you're so interested in this particular piece of land?" Eleanor inquired, her tone conversational. The brothers exchanged glances. "We're consolidating our holdings," Victor replied. "Efficiency of operation. Your property sits in a location that would connect 2 portions of our ranch." It wasn't a lie, Eleanor realized, but it certainly wasn't the whole truth. The water access was conspicuously unmentioned. "I appreciate your interest," she said carefully. "However, I've recently formed a partnership to develop this property myself. I'm not currently interested in selling." Victor's genial expression hardened. "Miss Harmon, with all due respect, you're new to this territory. Ranching is a difficult business, especially for someone with your background." "I'm aware of the challenges," Eleanor replied evenly. "Fortunately, my partner has considerable experience." She nodded toward Ben, whose expression remained impassive. Clarence Millbrook's laugh held no humor. "Jordan, he's a hired hand, not a businessman." "Mr. Jordan was my father's foreman for 5 years," Eleanor corrected. "He knows this land intimately and has my complete confidence." The atmosphere in the cabin had chilled noticeably. Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping. $3,000, Miss Harmon, final offer. I suggest you consider carefully before refusing." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I'll consider your offer, Mr. Millbrook, and inform you of my decision within the week." The brothers clearly hadn't expected even this much concession. After a moment, Victor nodded. "Very well, we'll await your response." He placed a business card on the table. "You can send word to our office in town when you've made your decision." After the Millbrooks and their lawyer had departed, Eleanor let out a long breath. That was rather tense. "You handled it perfectly," Ben said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Didn't commit to anything, but didn't provoke them either." $3,000 is a lot of money, Eleanor mused. "Far more than the land is worth by ordinary standards." "Further proof that the water rights are what they're really after," Ben agreed. "We should be careful going forward. The Millbrooks don't take rejection well." Over the following days, Eleanor and Ben began implementing their plans for the property. Ben continued his regular work at the Rocking Horse Ranch, but spent most evenings and his days off at Eleanor's homestead. Together, they cleared overgrown areas, repaired fencing, and prepared the ground for spring planting. Word of their partnership spread quickly through Taylor. Some townsfolk expressed support, particularly those who had admired Harold Harmon and resented the Millbrooks' growing influence. Others were skeptical of Eleanor's ability to adapt to frontier life or of the propriety of her close working relationship with Ben. "You should consider hiring a woman to live with you," Ben suggested one evening as they reviewed their seed inventory. "For propriety's sake, if nothing else, people talk." Eleanor looked up from her list. "Are people talking about us?" "Some," Ben admitted. "Nothing malicious, but a young, unmarried woman living alone and spending time with a single man. It raises eyebrows." Eleanor considered this. In Boston, such an arrangement would indeed have caused a scandal, but here, practical considerations seemed more important than social ones. Still, she understood Ben's concern. "Perhaps Mrs. Patterson knows someone suitable," she conceded. "Though I hate to spend money on wages when we need every cent for the farm. Maybe someone who could contribute skills," Ben suggested. "A woman who knows preserving or cheese making. That would align with some of your father's alternative business ideas." The next day, Eleanor visited Mrs. Patterson again, explaining her situation. The storekeeper's wife thought for a moment, then brightened. "Ada Green might be perfect. She's a widow, about 40, very respectable. Her husband was a cheesemaker before he passed, and she knows the craft well. She's been taking in laundry to make ends meet, but I know she'd prefer something that uses her real skills." Within a week, Ada Green had moved into the small second bedroom of Eleanor's cabin. The arrangement proved beneficial beyond just addressing propriety concerns. Ada was indeed skilled at cheese making and preserving, and she knew how to spin wool and make soap, practical abilities that Eleanor lacked entirely. More importantly, she provided female companionship. Eleanor had not realized how much she missed conversing with another woman, until she found herself sharing evening conversations with Ada by the fire, discussing everything from recipes to literature. "You and Mr. Jordan seem to be making good progress," Ada commented one evening in late November as they prepared for bed. "He's a good man." "He is," Eleanor agreed, perhaps too quickly. "A good partner. The farm would be impossible without his knowledge." Ada's knowing smile suggested she heard more in Eleanor's words than was explicitly stated. "It's more than knowledge he brings, dear. It's heart. I see how he looks at this place and at you." Eleanor busied herself with turning down the lamp, hoping the dimming light would hide her blush. "We're business partners, nothing more, if you say so," Ada replied, unconvinced. "But in my experience, the best marriages start as partnerships of equals." The word marriage sent an unexpected flutter through Eleanor's chest. She had come west with no thought of romance, focused entirely on claiming her inheritance and determining her future path. Yet she couldn't deny that her feelings for Ben had grown from gratitude to respect to something deeper and more complex. As winter settled over the valley, work on the property necessarily slowed. The ground froze solid, making further preparation impossible until spring. Instead, Ben focused on improvements to the cabin and outbuildings, while Eleanor finalized their business plan and continued discussions with the bank. Mr. Whitman had been cautiously encouraging about their proposal for a combined orchard and specialty dairy operation, particularly after meeting with both Eleanor and Ben together. "You've done your research," he acknowledged, "and Jordan's experience balances your lack of it, Miss Harmon. I'll present your loan application to the board next month." December brought heavy snow and bitter cold. Ben's visits became less frequent as travel between the rocking horse and Eleanor's homestead grew more difficult. When he did arrive, often staying overnight in the small barn rather than risking the return journey in darkness, Eleanor found herself counting the hours until his departure with increasing regret. Christmas approached, bringing with it a wistfulness Eleanor hadn't anticipated. In Boston, the holiday had been a grand affair with parties, elaborate dinners, and carefully chosen gifts. Here, survival took precedence over celebration. "We always have a community dinner at the town hall on Christmas Day," Ada informed her. "Everyone brings what they can. There's music and dancing afterward." "That sounds lovely," Eleanor said, though she wondered what she could possibly contribute when their supplies were so limited. The answer came unexpectedly. 3 days before Christmas, Ben arrived with a freshly killed deer draped across his horse. "Thought you ladies might appreciate some fresh meat," he explained as he set about butchering it behind the barn. "This is too much for just us," Eleanor observed, watching him work with efficient precision. "Thought you might take some to the Christmas dinner," Ben replied. "Venison's always welcome, especially in winter." "Will you attend?" Eleanor asked, trying to sound casual. Ben looked up from his work, a half-smile crossing his face. "Wouldn't miss it. Might even ask a certain businesswoman to dance if she's amenable." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm despite the frigid air. I imagined she would be. The Christmas gathering proved to be even more enjoyable than the harvest celebration had been. The town hall was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and a massive fire kept the space warm despite the snow falling outside. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, including Eleanor and Ada's venison stew, which received numerous compliments. The Millbrook brothers were noticeably absent, a fact that seemed to improve the general mood. They usually spend Christmas at their ranch, Ben explained when Eleanor mentioned it, prefer their own company to the townspeople's. After dinner, the musicians struck up lively tunes and the center of the room was cleared for dancing. Ben, true to his word, approached Eleanor with an extended hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Harmon?" "You may indeed, Mr. Jordan," she replied, placing her hand in his. They moved well together, Eleanor now more familiar with the patterns of the country dances. During a particularly energetic reel, Ben pulled her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed, his hand warm at the small of her back. "You've changed since you arrived," he observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "For better or worse?" Eleanor asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Definitely better," Ben replied, his eyes warm. "You've grown stronger, more confident. You belong here now." The simple statement affected Eleanor more deeply than any flowery compliment could have. She did feel as though she belonged, in a way she never had in Boston despite being born and raised there. This harsh, beautiful land had claimed her heart, as had the community that survived upon it and perhaps, most of all, the man currently guiding her through the intricate steps of the dance. The evening ended too soon, with families bundling into sleighs and wagons for the journey home through the snowy night. Ben had brought his sleigh, a practical conveyance that comfortably accommodated the three of them. As they glided over the snow-covered road, Eleanor found herself moved by the stark beauty of the moonlit landscape. Stars blazed overhead with a clarity she had never witnessed in the city, and the silence was profound, broken only by the jingle of harness bells and the soft shush of runners on snow. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, more to herself than her companions. "It is," Ben agreed from beside her, his gaze fixed not on the landscape but on her face. Ada, seated on Eleanor's other side, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The days between Christmas and New Year passed quietly. Ben continued his work on the barn whenever weather permitted, preparing space for the animals they hoped to acquire in spring. Eleanor and Ada experimented with cheese recipes using milk purchased from neighboring farms, planning for when they would have their own dairy cows. On New Year's Eve, Ben arrived with a bottle of wine, a luxury item he'd purchased from the general store at considerable expense. "Thought we might toast to the future," he explained as Ada found 3 cups. They sat before the fire, the cabin warm and comfortable despite the howling wind outside. Eleanor felt a contentment she had not expected to find when she'd first arrived in this wild territory. She had come seeking merely to claim an inheritance. Instead, she had found a purpose and a community and perhaps something even more precious. "To 1879, Ben proposed, raising his cup. "May it bring health, prosperity, and happiness to this partnership." "To 1879, Eleanor and Ada echoed, drinking to the toast. Later, after Ada had retired to her room, Eleanor and Ben remained by the fire, talking quietly of their plans for spring. The conversation eventually dwindled into comfortable silence, both of them watching the dancing flames. "Eleanor," Ben said finally, his voice unusually hesitant, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." She turned toward him, noting the seriousness in his expression. "What is it?" Ben set down his cup and shifted to face her more directly. "These past months, working alongside you, I've come to admire you more than I can properly express." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "I admire you as well, Ben." "It's more than admiration for me," he continued, his eyes holding her steadily. "Much more. I find myself thinking of you constantly, even when we're apart, especially when we're apart." Eleanor could hardly breathe. "Ben, please let me finish before my courage fails," he said quickly. "I know we entered into this as a business arrangement, and if that's all you want it to be, I'll respect that completely." But I need you to know that my feelings have grown far beyond partnership or even friendship." In the firelight, his face was earnest and vulnerable in a way Eleanor had never seen before. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "My feelings have grown as well," she admitted softly. "In Boston, I never understood what drew my father to this place, why he would choose such a difficult life. Now I do. There's a freedom here, a chance to build something real with your own hands." She tightened her grip on his hand, "and with the right person beside you." Ben's expression transformed, hope replacing uncertainty. "Eleanor Harmon, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that our partnership has become the most important thing in my life," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "And not because of the land or the business prospects." Ben moved closer, one hand rising to gently touch her cheek. "May I kiss you, Eleanor? I've been wanting to since that first night when your lantern flickered in the wind." Instead of answering, Eleanor leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, then with growing certainty. Ben's arms encircled her, strong and secure, as the kiss deepened into something that felt remarkably like coming home. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Ben rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eleanor. I think I have since the moment you stood on that porch, facing the unknown with such determination." "I love you too, Benjamin Jordan," she whispered, the words feeling both new and inevitable. "Though I suspect Ada has known it longer than either of us." Ben laughed softly. "Mrs. Green is a perceptive woman. She told me last week that I should stop pretending our partnership was purely business before someone else came along and swept you off your feet." "Did she indeed?" Eleanor smiled. "And here I thought I was being so circumspect with my feelings." "About as circumspect as a prairie fire," Ben teased, stealing another brief kiss. They remained by the fire, talking and planning, their partnership now acknowledged as something far more profound. Ben spoke of building a proper house on the property once the business was established, with room for a family. Eleanor shared her vision for gardens and perhaps a small schoolroom where she might teach neighboring children. "We should wait to marry until after spring planting," Eleanor said practically. "There's so much work to be done before then." "Always the businesswoman," Ben said with a smile, "but I agree, we establish the farm first, build our future on solid ground." When Ben finally left for the barn, the night was well advanced, stars still brilliant in the clear sky. Eleanor watched from the doorway as he crossed the yard, her heart full to bursting with emotions she had never expected to feel in this remote place. As she prepared for bed, she could hear Ada moving about in her room, undoubtedly awake and aware of the evening's developments. Tomorrow would bring knowing smiles and gentle teasing, but Eleanor didn't mind. She had found her place in this wild land, not just a piece of property to manage, but a true home and a partner with whom to share it. Spring arrived gradually, snow melting to reveal muddy ground that slowly dried and greened. True to their plan, Eleanor and Ben focused primarily on establishing the farm during these crucial months. They worked from dawn to dusk most days, plowing fields, planting the first seedlings in the newly prepared orchard, and constructing proper fencing. The bank had approved their loan in February, providing enough capital to purchase 2 milk cows, a small flock of chickens, and the necessary equipment for Ada's cheese-making operation. By April, they had produced their first experimental batches of cheese, some of which had already been sold to the general store and the hotel restaurant in Taylor. Word of their success spread, bringing both positive and negative attention. Several neighboring farmers expressed interest in selling milk to their small dairy, potentially expanding the operation faster than they had initially planned. But the Millbrooks, true to Ben's prediction, had not taken Eleanor's rejection well. First came rumors that they were diverting additional water upstream from Eleanor's property. Ben rode out to investigate and confirmed that a new dam had indeed been constructed, though it hadn't yet significantly impacted their creek. Then came more direct intimidation. One morning in late April, Eleanor awoke to find 2 of her fence posts pulled up and thrown aside. A week later, someone scattered roofing nails on the path leading to her property, puncturing the hooves of one of their horses. "They're trying to scare you into selling," Ben said grimly after treating the injured horse. "Make you think it's not worth the trouble to stay." "Well, they've misjudged me entirely," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her concern. "I'm not easily frightened, and I certainly won't reward bullying tactics." Nevertheless, they took precautions. Ben began spending more nights at the property, eventually moving most of his belongings into the barn loft. The arrangement raised a few eyebrows in town, but with Ada's respectable presence in the house, most people accepted it as a security measure rather than a scandal. In early May, their vigilance was justified. Eleanor was awakened shortly after midnight by the sound of Ada's urgent voice. "Fire." "Eleanor, wake up. There's a fire in the barn." Eleanor scrambled from bed, heart pounding. Through the window, she could see flames already licking at one corner of the barn where they stored hay. Ben's horse was outside, which meant he was aware of the danger, but she couldn't see Ben himself. Throwing on a robe, Eleanor ran outside, Ada close behind her. The night air was cold against her face, contrasting sharply with the heat emanating from the burning building. She scanned the area frantically, finally spotting Ben at the water pump, filling buckets as quickly as possible. "Ben." She called, running toward him. "Are you all right? Stay back," he shouted, his face grim in the firelight. "Get the horses away from the barn." Eleanor changed direction, moving to secure the frightened animals that were tied to a hitching post near the burning structure. As she led them to a safer distance, she heard the crack of a rifle shot, followed by Ben's shout of pain. Terror seized her. "Ben, get down," he yelled, diving behind the water pump as another shot rang out. Eleanor dropped to the ground, heart hammering. In the confusion of the fire and darkness, she couldn't see where the shots had come from. She began crawling toward Ben, desperate to reach him. "I'm fine," he called to her, reading her intention. "Just grazed my arm, stay where you are." From the direction of the road came the sound of galloping horses, at least two, maybe three, moving away rapidly. The shooters were fleeing. With the immediate danger past, Eleanor rushed to Ben's side. His left sleeve was dark with blood, but the wound didn't appear life-threatening. Together they turned their attention to the fire, which had spread to nearly half the barn. "We need help," Eleanor decided, seeing that their bucket brigade would be insufficient. "I'll ride for town." "Too dangerous," Ben argued. "They could still be out there." "We'll lose everything if that fire reaches the house," Eleanor countered. "I'll be fast." Before Ben could protest further, she was on her horse, riding hard toward Taylor. The journey felt endless, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes before she was pounding on Sheriff Miller's door, then rousing other townspeople to help. By the time they returned with a wagon of men and additional water barrels, the barn was nearly consumed, but Ben and Ada had managed to keep the flames from spreading to the house or other outbuildings. With the additional help, they finally extinguished the last of the fire as dawn broke over the valley. Sheriff Miller surveyed the smoking ruins with a grave expression. This was deliberate, no question, found where they poured coal oil along the south wall. And the shooting. Eleanor asked, still shaken by how close Ben had come to serious injury. "Meant to prevent you from fighting the fire, I'd wager," the sheriff replied. "Scare tactics." "The Millbrooks," Ben said flatly. It wasn't a question, Sheriff Miller sighed. "Likely so, though proving it will be difficult." "They'd have hired someone to do the actual work." Eleanor surveyed the destruction, anger gradually replacing her fear. The barn could be rebuilt, but the message was clear. The Millbrooks would not stop until they had what they wanted. "What do we do now?" She asked Ben when the sheriff and other helpers had departed, promising to return later to assist with clearing the debris. Ben's expression was determined despite his bandaged arm and exhausted state. "We rebuild, Eleanor. We don't let them win." Ada nodded firmly. "And perhaps we take the fight to them in other ways. Legal ways." The following days were consumed with salvaging what could be saved and planning for rebuilding. The news of the attack spread quickly through the community, generating more support than Eleanor had expected. Farmers and ranchers who had their own reasons to resent the Millbrooks' tactics offered materials and labor for the new barn. The hotel restaurant doubled its order for Ada's cheese, providing much-needed income. Most surprisingly, a letter arrived from Mr. Whitman at the bank, expressing concern about the incident and offering to extend their loan terms if necessary to cover rebuilding costs. Public opinion is turning against the Millbrooks, Ben observed as they reviewed the unexpected offer. This may have been a miscalculation on their part, Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, which means they'll either back down or escalate further. Her expression hardened. We should be prepared for either outcome. They decided that Ben would move into the house proper rather than rebuilding the loft in the barn, a decision that would have caused scandal a few months earlier, but now seemed eminently practical given the circumstances. Ada's presence still provided propriety, though Eleanor found herself caring less about such considerations with each passing day. We could simply get married now, Ben suggested one evening as they discussed the sleeping arrangements. Save ourselves the trouble of explaining to the gossips. Eleanor smiled at his practical approach. Is that your idea of a romantic proposal, Benjamin Jordan? He laughed, pulling her into his arms. You know I proposed properly on New Year's Eve. This is merely a suggestion about timing. She rested her head against his chest, considering. I always imagined being married in the orchard with the trees in bloom, but that's still years away. We could marry twice, Ben suggested, only half joking. Once now for practicality and again when the orchard blooms for romance. In the end, they compromised. They would marry in June, after the new barn was completed, but before the busiest part of the summer season. The ceremony would take place on their property, not in the orchard, but beneath the large cottonwood tree near the creek, a spot that had become special to them both during their planning walks. May passed in a blur of activity. The new barn rose quickly with community help, larger and sturdier than the original. Ben moved his belongings into the small second bedroom of the cabin, though Eleanor noted with amusement that Ada conveniently found reasons to visit friends in town with increasing frequency, leaving them alone together more often than not. The Millbrooks, meanwhile, maintained an ominous silence. No further incidents occurred on the property, but Eleanor remained wary. She had written a detailed account of the fire and shooting to a lawyer in Cheyenne, seeking advice on legal recourse. His response, when it arrived, was not encouraging. Without clear evidence linking the Millbrooks to the attack, little could be done. We'll need to be vigilant, Ben said after reading the letter. But we can't let fear rule our lives either. June arrived with unusually mild weather, perfect for their wedding plans. Eleanor, with Ada's help, transformed her mother's wedding dress, which she had brought from Boston more as a keepsake than with any expectation of wearing it. The alterations made it more suitable for a frontier wedding while preserving its elegant essence. 3 days before the wedding, Eleanor was in town purchasing final supplies when she encountered Victor Millbrook outside the general store. It was their first direct meeting since his visit to her property months earlier. Miss Harmon, he greeted her, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. I understand congratulations are in order. Marriage to one's hired hand is certainly economical. Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. Mr. Jordan is my business partner and soon to be my husband, Mr. Millbrook. I would appreciate you referring to him with appropriate respect. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, no offense intended. He gestured to her purchases. Your little dairy experiment seems to be proceeding despite recent setbacks. Our business is thriving, thank you, Eleanor replied coolly, refusing to acknowledge the implied connection between him and the fire. In fact, we're considering expansion earlier than planned due to demand. This was stretching the truth considerably, but the flash of annoyance in Victor's eyes made the exaggeration worthwhile. How? Enterprising, he said finally. Still, should you reconsider your position on selling, our offer remains open. For now, the threat was thinly veiled, but Eleanor maintained her composure. I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Millbrook, though I see no circumstances under which I would choose to sell to you or your brother. As she walked away, Eleanor could feel Victor's gaze boring into her back, but she didn't give him the satisfaction of turning around. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied her horse from the hitching post, but her resolve was firmer than ever. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect June morning. Friends and neighbors began arriving early, bringing food, flowers, and good wishes. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, conducted by the town's minister beneath the cottonwood tree, just as they had planned. Eleanor would later remember little of the specific words spoken, but she would never forget the look in Ben's eyes as they exchanged vows, or the feel of his hands steady and warm around hers, or the cheer that rose from their assembled friends when they were pronounced husband and wife. The celebration continued well into evening, with music and dancing on the packed earth of the new barn floor. As twilight descended, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the gathering. "Mrs. Jordan," Ben said softly, finding a moment alone with her as the festivities continued. "How does it feel?" "Wonderful," Eleanor replied truthfully. "Though I think I'll keep Harmon for business purposes. Eleanor Harmon Jordan has a certain professional ring to it, don't you think?" Ben laughed, pulling her closer. "Always the businesswoman, I wouldn't have it any other way." As they rejoined their guests, Eleanor caught sight of Sheriff Miller in conversation with Mr. Whitman from the bank, both men looking uncharacteristically serious despite the festive atmosphere. When the sheriff noticed her attention, he nodded slightly, indicating they should speak. "What is it?" Eleanor asked when she and Ben had made their way over to the two men. Sheriff Miller glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "We've had some news that might interest you. Clarence Millbrook was arrested in Cheyenne yesterday." "Arrested?" Ben repeated, surprised. "For what?" "Land fraud," Mr. Whitman replied quietly. "Apparently he's been forging documents to expand their holdings illegally. The territorial governor's office has been investigating for months." Eleanor exchanged glances with Ben, processing this unexpected development, and Victor. "No charges against him yet," the sheriff said, "but with Clarence facing prison, their position isn't as strong as it was. Thought you should know." "Thank you," Eleanor said sincerely. "That is significant information." After the men moved away, Ben turned to Eleanor, a cautious optimism in his expression. "This could change everything if the Millbrooks are weakened legally and financially." "They might not be in a position to threaten us any longer," Eleanor finished, "at least not so brazenly." The news added an extra layer of joy to their wedding day, a sense that perhaps the path ahead might be somewhat smoother than they had anticipated. As the last guests departed, calling final congratulations and well wishes, Ben and Eleanor stood arm in arm on the porch of what was now truly their home. The night was clear, stars brilliant above them, the soft sounds of the creek providing gentle background music to the moment. "I never imagined this when I first arrived," Eleanor mused, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "I thought I'd sell whatever was left of my father's property and return to Boston within a month. And now?" Ben asked, his voice warm with affection. Eleanor turned to face him, her heart full. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else. This land, this life, it's become part of me in a way I never expected." Ben's kiss was gentle, a promise of both passion and partnership. "Your father would be proud, Eleanor. Not just of what you've built here, but of who you've become." "We've built," she corrected softly, "and we're only just beginning." The years that followed brought both challenges and triumphs. The orchard flourished more quickly than expected, producing its first small crop just 3 years after planting. The dairy operation expanded gradually, with Ada's cheeses winning recognition at the territorial fair in Cheyenne. Eleanor and Ben worked side by side through drought and prosperity, their partnership strengthening with each season. Victor Millbrook eventually faced his own legal troubles and was forced to sell portions of his holdings to cover his brother's debts and legal fees. The water access that had been at the heart of the conflict remained secure, allowing Eleanor and Ben to implement innovative irrigation systems that increased their productivity. In the spring of 1882, their first child was born, a son they named Harold Benjamin, in honor of both Eleanor's father and his own. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Margaret Ada, named for Ben's mother and their faithful friend and business partner. By 1885, their property had expanded to 15 acres through the purchase of adjacent land. The original cabin had been enlarged and improved, though they maintained its core structure out of sentiment. Their business had diversified to include honey production and a small apple cider operation that utilized fruit from their now productive orchard. On cool autumn evenings, Eleanor often found herself on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Sometimes she would light the old lantern that had illuminated her first night in Wyoming Territory, the night when her uncertain future had first intersected with Benjamin Jordan's steady presence. Remembering. Ben would ask, joining her with a child on each hip, his voice as warm and reassuring as it had been that first night when her lantern flickered in the wind and the cowboy cupped his hands around the flame. Remembering, Eleanor would confirm, moving to embrace her family. And grateful for every moment since.